Greetings and welcome to Halfling 13 Gaming. Today we're painting up a new unit for Star Wars Legion and the Grand Army of the Republic, a unit of clone ARF troopers along with the Jedi Guardian that comes in the kit. As a basic intro, I should state I'm not a professional and I did not paint at competition levels. Some might claim I don't even paint at tabletop standards, though at a certain point any paint is good paint. My process is intended to be easy to follow and easy to repeat, with only some basic skills and colors. With that disclaimer out of the way, let's get started. The materials we'll need for this are simple: some basic paints, some brushes, and a willingness to make mistakes. The clones don't have much color variation, and the Jedi is fairly basic, so this project required about 3 hours from start to finish for me to complete the painting. My collection consists of Citadel contrast paints and Army Painter airbrush paints, but generally any paint line should work. For this painting effort, the paints used are as follows. For the ARF clones, we used Wraithbone spray paint, Black Templar contrast, Guilliman flesh contrast, Nuln oil, matte white from Army Painter, matte black, and Martian iron earth as an optional covering for the base. For the Jedi Guardian, we have Wraithbone spray paint, Black Templar contrast, Apothecary white contrast, Dark Oath flesh contrast, Snakebite leather contrast, Gorgrunta fur contrast, some neon blue from Army Painter Air, some lead belcher, some matte black, and again some Martian iron earth for the optional base covering. You might be wondering why I use airbrush paints instead of more traditional mixes such as Army Painter war paints. This is due to the consistency. Airbrush paints are pre-thinned for the airbrush. However, this also means they're pre-thinned for other uses, including for thin coats by the brush. I could either use a wet palette or thinner and thin the paints manually each time, or I could just use airbrush consistency. And if I care to airbrush, paint is already ready to go. We start off after the models have been assembled and primed. I assemble my model kits typically with super glue, but in this case I've opted for plastic cement. It tends to dry faster, be just as secure, and I rarely glue my fingers together. Each of the models is then given a basic primer coat with a rattle can primer. I'm using Citadel's Wraithbone since it works very well with contrast paints, but Corax White is good too, or any slightly off-white spray paint. For speed, I opted not to do anything fancy like zenithal highlighting or similar techniques. Those work, but this painting isn't going to be at that level, and it would require using the airbrush. Once primed, we start the actual painting. Clone armor is generally white with a dark inner bodysuit. As such, I'm starting to pick out all the bodysuit pieces in Black Templar, a Citadel contrast paint. Try to avoid too much on the armor plating, the later stages will hide that pretty well. As a standard, I also use Black Templar on weapons in Legion, so that makes covering the rifles easy as well. For each of the clones, a few bits on the visors and face mask require these details as well. For the ARF Trooper Squad Leader, I left his helmet off, meaning we have some skin tone to paint. This is done with Guilliman flesh contrast paint. A simple, even coating gives the basic weathered skin look of the clones. If you have the steady hand to do the eyes, this is when you would do them, but my eyes tend to look more googly than realistic, so I rarely do so. The contrast paint instead gives the impression, but without that level of detail. At this point, the clones are color blocked, but still rather rough looking. As such, it's time for Nuln oil, which I've found to be an impressive general use tool. A healthy covering across the entire model, and the wash blends the lines between colors, darkens shadows, and generally gives a much more coherent shade to the model. It also helps to dirty up the armor since soldiers rarely have clean clothing. The main trick with Nuln oil is to not let it pool too heavily in any spot, and to make sure all of the model is covered. Any sections not touched will be noticeably brighter and stand out. The Nuln oil takes a little bit of time to dry, but once it is, the clone armor will be looking a bit dingy, though the inner bodysuit should have blended in well with the natural shadows. Now it's time for some focused brightness for the armor in the form of a white dry brushing. Use a small, old brush, load it up with some white, in my case Army Painter Flat White, then brush off almost all of the paint onto a board, tray, or paper towel. Ideally for dry brushing, you want your brush slightly damp first before the paint, which helps avoid a chalky texture on the model. Very lightly and carefully, start to dry brush the model, starting at the top and working down towards the base. Try, if possible, to avoid the weapons and larger bodysuit sections. The white should be subtle, but noticeable. If there isn't enough, press slightly harder or repeat coverage on a section. Avoid the temptation for more paint. The goal here is to lightly brush the highlights, not do complete coverage. With a little bit of time, the armor will brighten up a bit, providing now 3 layers of tone. The bright white highlights, the dingy gray of the main armor pieces, and the dark shadows of the recesses, along with the dark interior bodysuit. If you've accidentally dry brushed any of the weapons, now is a good time to return to the Black Templar and do a touch-up or two. Otherwise, basic ARF troopers are now painted, and it's time to change the focus to the bases. For our Republic clones, we tried to be consistent on the bases, using a pattern determined by my son many months ago. This consists of a black undercoat covered by Citadel Technical Paint Martian Iron Earth. This gives a rusty red coloration similar in theme to Geonosia, and when the paint dries it creates a crackled, cracky pattern of dried mud. Starting with a coating of black paint, in my case I used Army Painter Airbrush Black, but this is a case where the airbrush thinness worked against me. Ideally, you want a single solid layer of black, trying to avoid the model's feet and any other base decorations. Give that coat plenty of time to dry, or the colors will bleed into the next step. Then you apply the Martian Iron Earth using a flat-edged old brush. This technical paint goes on more like mud rather than a paint. It's important to go fairly heavy and unevenly. The thicker the layer of the paint, the more the cracks will appear. That's where the black comes in. Where the red mud cracks, you'll see the black beneath, and the black helps to conceal any areas where the Iron Earth misses. This layer also takes a while to dry. Depending on the thickness, I generally give it overnight before considering it done. At that point, you can add any other base decorations you might like grasses, plants, rocks, etc. Though in keeping with the rest of our army, I've opted for plain. The final step then is to finish off the rim of the base with a coating of black paint. Again, I used Army Painter Airbrush Black, just a quick swipe along all of the outer base edges, and the model looks a lot more complete. This can also be helpful to clean up any of the ground texture that may have spilled over the edge. At this point, your clone ARF troopers are ready for the table, or you can experiment with some more advanced techniques. You can try some edge highlighting, or redarken some of the bodysuit pieces. In my use, those steps tend to take a lot of time, but with my skill level have minimal benefits. However, since our Republic army is inspired by Obi-Wan Kenobi's 212th Attack Battalion, I needed to mimic the prior coloration. This means a layer of yellow-orange on various spots. Specifically, this is Army Painter Airbrush Incursion Orange, applied to the shoulders, elbows, and knee pads on each of the clones. Looking at reference photos, it isn't necessarily accurate locations, but this is the theme George had decided upon, so I needed to be consistent. With the clones done, let's change focus over to the Jedi Guardian. The Guardian starts the same, assemble with plastic cement, prime with rape bone. From there, we obviously deviate since there isn't any clone armor. I started with Black Templar contrast since at the time I already had it out. A quick coating on the gloves of the hand and the handle of the saber is all that's needed. From there, I applied a layer of Apothecary white contrast to the boots and the upper chest plate to try to mimic the coloring of the photos. The boots ended up okay, but I likely would have been better off with more white on the chest. The head of the Jedi I painted with Dark Oath flesh contrast to give a slightly darker tone than with the clones. Once it dries, the contrast provides a natural highlight to the horns and the usual darkness around the eyes. As before, now's a good time to do the eyes if you care to do that detail. For the clothing, I opted for Gore-Grunta fur contrast for the tunic and Snakebite leather contrast for the cloak. One thing to note, especially on the cloak, contrast paints do not play well typically with large flat surfaces. The paint likes recesses and details and operates more like a stain on large surfaces. For that reason, try to paint in one long continuous stroke rather than several. Otherwise, the contrast paint will show the brush strokes and have an extra layer of color. Your goal is a single continuous tone, and each time you go back, you'll be applying a new dark layer over an existing one, resulting in uneven transitions. It's a delicate balance. You want a continuous line, but you also want to avoid any pooling of color. In truth, the cloak would have been better with some of the non-contrast paints, followed by a wash and highlight, but I was impatient. From here, I finished up the details on the model with a bit of neon blue Army Painter airbrush on the lightsaber, and a very light dry brush of lead belcher on the boots to get them slightly more shiny. I opted to skip the Nuln Oil for this model specifically, since it was already rather dark colored, but in hindsight, it may have been worth it anyways. As before, now you can add any other layers of details. Edge highlight the details, dry brush the cloak or clothing, etc. A faint edge highlight of white on the lightsaber might work well to brighten up blue. But as usual, I opted to skip those as my skill to add details doesn't match the time commitment, so I moved on to the base. As with the clones, a black undercoat and a layer of Martian iron earth gives the Geonosian sand texture. This is a time where I didn't let the black undercoat dry fully, resulting in some bleeding of the color onto the texture paste. And after cleaning up the rib of the base, the Jedi Guardian and the ARF troopers are now completed and ready for gaming. Thank you for watching to the end. If you've enjoyed this content, leave a like or subscribe to the channel for more content. We post battle reports where these models will likely make an appearance. If you have any hints, tricks, or techniques to try, leave us a comment. I'm willing to experiment a bit, especially on some of the non-Legion models. I'd also be curious to see your efforts in painting for either this unit or others.